good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable time. Indeed, Christmas time is not the time when most of the populace expects to hear a ghost story. However, I will endeavor in this ghostly little tale to raise the ghost of an idea, which shall not put you out of humor with yourselves, with the season, or with me. I only wish that it may haunt you pleasantly. Christmas time is a pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem, by one consent, to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of all people as fellow passengers to the grave. And therefore, though Christmas has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good. And I say, God bless it. Christmas Eve, old tight-fisted and covetous Ebenezer Scrooge sat busy in the shivering chill of his counting house. In the dismal cell that was the next room, his clerk, Bob Cratchit, worked by a stove. The flame kept barely alive with less than one lump of coal to fuel the flickering ember. That afternoon, Scrooge reluctantly looked up as a visitor entered his office.
Your uncle?
It was Scrooge's niece, Elizabeth, who had arrived full of the spirit of Christmas. She presented a generous invitation, to which Ebenezer Scrooge sternly replied,
"Bah! Humbug!"
As Elizabeth left, two ladies, pleasant to behold, arrived at the door with their hats in hand, seeking to collect charitable donations for the poor.
What can we put you down for, Mr. Scrooge?
Nothing!
Ah, so you want to remain anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. I'll have no prisons. I'll have no workhouses.
Yes, but many can't go there and most would rather die.
If they had rather die, they better do it and decrease the surplus population.
Scrooge dismissed the two ladies without giving them a penny. After closing up for the day and begrudgingly giving Bob Cratchit the next day off for Christmas, Scrooge retired to his gloomy home. As he slid his key into the lock of his front door, an apparition appeared in the door knocker. It was the ghostly face of his former partner, Jacob Marley, who had died 7 years before that very night. Startled, Scrooge entered into his dark, cold house, stepped cautiously up the stairs, and locked himself in his room. He sat down in his chair and began to eat his gruel. Soon he noticed the faint ringing of an unused bell that hung in the corner. One by one, every bell in the house began to ring out and ring out loudly. Suddenly, Scrooge heard footsteps heavily thumping up the stairs, and with them a clanking noise, as if a person were dragging a heavy chain. A ghostly figure floated in through the locked door. It was Jacob Marley, bound in chains and dragging behind him a trail of cash boxes, keys, ledgers, deeds, padlocks, and more chains wrought in steel. Though he saw the death-cold phantom standing before him, Scrooge railed against his senses and growled.
You are humbug, I tell you! Humbug!
I have wandered the earth for 7 years as punishment for neglecting the needs of my fellow men. I've come to warn you that you have a chance of escaping the same fate. You will be visited by 3 spirits, Scrooge. Expect the first tomorrow when the clock tolls 1.
Then the ghost of Marley floated out through an open window into the bleak, dark night. Scrooge slammed shut the window and went straight to bed without undressing, and exhausted, fell asleep upon the instant. Scrooge awoke. It was still quite dark and extremely cold. Perplexed and deeply bothered with a mix of dread and astonishment as he thought of Marley's ghost, he asked himself,
Was it a tree or not?
As the clock struck 1, with a melancholy toll, Scrooge all of a sudden recalled Marley's promise of the first ghostly visit. At that, the curtains of his bed were drawn apart by a strange, childlike figure, dressed in white, from whose head sprung a bright, clear jet of light.
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past.
No, your past.
What brought you here?
Your welfare. Rise and walk with me.
Taking Scrooge's hand, the two floated gently through the window. Instantly, the ghost transported Scrooge to the countryside where he had been raised. The city had vanished, as had the darkness and the mist. What you see are but shadows of the things
that have been,
said the ghost. Recognizing every gate, post, and tree, Scrooge was brought to his old school, empty, but not quite deserted. Indeed, Scrooge wept as he saw his poor forgotten self as he used to be, a solitary child left behind. The ghost motioned toward the classroom door, and it opened, and a little girl darted in. It was Scrooge's little sister, Fan. Scrooge reminisced sadly that Fan had died as a woman some years ago, and had but one child, his niece, Elizabeth. In but that moment, the schoolhouse was left behind them, and Scrooge and the ghost were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, at a certain warehouse door. The ghost asked Scrooge if he knew it.
No, I was apprenticed here.
They watched as a jolly Christmas party ensued, with dancing, singing, and merriment all around. Ebenezer, now a grown young man, and his fellow apprentice Dick Wilkins were leading the way, and with them the jovial old merchant Fezziwig. During the whole of this time, old Scrooge's heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He remembered everything, and he enjoyed everything. The scene faded to the past. Scrooge immediately saw himself at a different time, when he was slightly older in the prime of life. There was an eager, greedy, restless light in his eye. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a very young woman named Belle, in whose eyes there were tears. Scrooge and the ghost watched as she handed him back her golden engagement ring.
Spirit, why do you torture me? No more. No more.
But there was more. Taken to a more recent Christmas, Scrooge saw the same Belle, now a comely middle-aged matron, surrounded by her delightsome and loving family. As he watched, Scrooge was flooded with a dreadful awareness that he was quite alone in the world. Tormented by these scenes from the past, Scrooge exclaimed,
Spirit, remove me from this place. Take me back. Haunt me no longer.
The light of the ghost was extinguished. Immediately, he was back in his own room and sank into a deep sleep. Suddenly, Scrooge awoke, as again the bell was upon the stroke of 1. Scrooge rose from his bed, trembling at the sight of light emanating from the next room. The old hearth was ablaze, the room transformed. Holly, mistletoe, and ivy hung all about. Sitting on a throne of meats, red-hot chestnuts, fruits, plum puddings, cakes, and seething bowls of punch was a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore in his hand a glowing torch shaped like a cornucopia.
Come and get to know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas.
Boomed the joyful spirit, who was dressed in a deep green robe, bordered in white fur.
Spirit, I went falls last night to the You have aught to teach me. Let me profit by.
Touch my robe.
The room melted away to reveal the simple home of Bob Cratchit and his humble Christmas Day dinner. In came Bob, with Tiny Tim on his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron brace. With his contented family gathered around the hearth, Bob proposed a toast.
Merry Christmas, my dears, and God bless us.
God bless us, everyone.
Scrooge quietly asked, with an interest he had never felt before.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner. If these shadows remain unchanged, Scrooge, the child will die.
Scrooge and the spirit stood alone in an open space. It had been a long night. Strangely, while Scrooge remained unchanged in his outward form, the ghost appeared older. Looking upon the aging ghost, Scrooge was startled to notice a pair of wretched, starving children who appeared from beneath his great robe.
That is of ignorance and want, and they are mad.
Have they no refuge? Oh, Esau's?
Are there workhouses? Are there prisons?
Are there none, Scrooge?
The clock struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. At the last stroke of midnight, Scrooge beheld a solemn phantom, darkly draped and hooded, coming toward him like a mist along the ground. Bending to his knees, Scrooge asked,
I am the presence of the ghost of future, the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
The spirit answered not, but pointed downward with an outstretched hand.
Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But as I know that your purpose is to do me good, I am prepared to bear your company and do it with a thankful heart.
The phantom moved away as it had come, and Scrooge followed in its shadow, which bore him up and carried him along. With that, the city seemed to spring up and encompass them of its own accord, and they stood before the stock exchange, where a cluster of men were carelessly discussing the death of a rich business acquaintance.
to a very cheap funeral. For upon my life, I'll help anyone who goes to it,
said one fellow with a yawn.
I don't mind going.
Observed another with a laugh, a cold, aloof, and unforgiving laugh. They left the busy scene and went to a foul and narrow part of town to a dingy, filthy pawn shop. The rascally owner, Old Joe, and some shady characters bartered over a collection of belongings stolen from some dead man. Scrooge was shuddering from head to foot.
Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own.
The ghost spread its dark robe before him like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed poor Bob Cratchit's home once again. This time, it was very quiet. The Cratchit family was gathered tenderly by the fireplace, but Tiny Tim was missing. Gone. His little crutch lying upon the mantel as a memorial. Scrooge was moved with compassion. Pondering the scenes of the night, he asked the ghost,
Spirit, who was the dead man whose things were bought, and whom the men laughed about?
In but a misty moment, he found himself in an overgrown, weed-choked churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed downward to a neglected tomb. Trembling, Scrooge crept toward it, and following the finger, read upon the gravestone his own name.
Ebenezer. Scrooge.
Shaking and clutching at the spirit's robe, Scrooge cried out,
Oh, Spirit, I will keep Christmas in my heart and honor it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me, and I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, please, Spirit, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on the stone.
Mysteriously, the form began to shrink. Wide-eyed, Scrooge watched as it collapsed. It became ever smaller, dwindled down, and transformed into a bedpost. Yes, the bedpost was his own.
I will live in the past, the present, and the future.
Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed.
The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob, Marley, heaven and Christmas time be praised.
Scrooge's heart swelled. He opened his window and, laughing and crying in the same breath, began to shout,
A Merry Christmas to one and all.
He called downward to a passing boy, promising a shilling and a half-crown to deliver a huge Christmas turkey to the Cratchit house. Scrooge dressed himself in his best, and then went out upon the street, greeting everyone he met with a good-humored and delighted smile. He happened upon the ladies who had been collecting for charity the day before. He offered his deepest apology for his previous behavior, and he pledged them a huge donation. Scrooge then found himself at Elizabeth's door, and knocking, asked if he could come to dinner. It was a wonderful party with wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, and wonderful happiness. But the next morning, Scrooge arrived early at the office to catch Bob Cratchit 18.5 minutes late in his arrival. Feigning anger, Scrooge began to scold Bob and then suddenly laughed.
A Merry Christmas, Bob. A Merry Christmas that I have given to you for any other year. I will raise your salary and endeavor to help your struggling family. Now make up the fires and get yourself another coal scuttle before you dot another eyeball, Cratchit.
Indeed, Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and definitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was as a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. May that truly be said of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God